Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. I see many of our friends from the greater community, from Nashville Organized Faction Hope, from greater you over in the other side of town, other people in the neighborhood. So welcome. We're just delighted to see you all here today for our Palmer lecture. I'm not quite sure when we started these lectures. 1883. So how many? Somebody who can do math. 1983. 1983. This is the what annual lecture then?
35th.
What? 35. That sounds like a special round number. This is a 35th annual Palmer Lecture for Human Rights. And that is because the very first minister of this congregation, Reverend Robert Palmer, was a committed human rights activist, very known in the community for being part of the civil rights team that made so many advances here in Nashville in the late 50s, early 60s. And he was here from 54 to 1954 to 1971. And, but by having this lecture in his memory, we are blessed to keep up with what's happening in human rights now. And so now I'd like to introduce Scales Farr, who is going to introduce to you the speaker.
Guest Palmer lecturer, a man with a passion for history and a talent who can take his research and translate it into engaging and entertaining reading. If you live in Williamson County and get your power from Middle Tennessee Electric Co-op, as we do, you are probably already familiar with Bill Carey. He is a columnist for the Co-op's monthly magazine, and he writes fascinating stories about different aspects of Tennessee history. He's also author of 6 published books focused on our state's history. Bill is co-founder and executive director of Tennessee History for Kids, a nonprofit that was established in 2004 to provide history and civics teaching materials in Tennessee's public schools. You see, most public schools in Tennessee don't provide civics or history, Tennessee history books for the kids, for textbooks. And so his project began with research, writing, and producing the History for Kids website. And since that time, they've expanded to include email alerts, posters, free videos, teacher training, and Tennessee history text booklets that the students use in class. In fact, these booklets are the most used resource for Tennessee history and social studies in lower schools across the state. Thousands of teachers use the booklets, websites, and videos, and we're very grateful to Bill for his work on that. Tonight, Bill will share with us a look at the darker side of Tennessee's history, at a darker side, I wish it were the only one, as he discusses Runaways, Coffles, and Fancy Girls, a history of slavery in Tennessee. After his talk, Bill will have copies of his book available for sale in the social hall, and in addition, a limited number of posters showing a collage of photos from the civil rights movement will also be available for free. And now please join me in welcoming our speaker, Bill Carey.
Is my mic on? Can y'all? Okay. What? Thank you for inviting me. I thought I'd start by talking about the column. She mentioned the column. People in Davidson County may not know about the column. How many of you are familiar with the column? A few of you? There's three. There's three people. This book started as a column. It sort of started with the column. The editor of Tennessee Magazine is Robin Conover, and she is a wonderful person, very patient person. And I've been doing it for 14 years now. And she'll call me up and she'll say, I need that column. And I'll say, when do you need it by? And she'll say, about 2 hours ago. And usually she's not kidding. She literally needs it like it's already too late. She needs it. And so I've promised her over the years that I would go down to I would get about 5 of them. So we'd have them in a can so she wouldn't have to wait till the last day and she could have a column. Is that me that's doing that thumping noise? Okay, I'll try not to move, okay? And so what I had an idea to do a column about the very first issue of the Knoxville Gazette, which is the first newspaper in Tennessee. By the way, I know we have at least one real expert on Tennessee history in the room, and so I'm doing something I don't normally do, which is I'm really making sure I have it all right as I say it. Be real careful about dates, because if I get them wrong, Dan Pomeroy might know. But I thought I would do, is that coming from me? Do you want me to do the handheld? Do what? Either that or the thumping will drive everyone crazy. What is wrong with him? Why don't we just do that? Okay. Get this thing off. Okay, how's this? Will this work better? So I thought I would do a column on the very first issues of the Knoxville Gazette. What were people writing about in the Knoxville Gazette? Thought it would be kind of a funny column, an uplifting column. And so I started looking through the Knoxville Gazette. They're at the Tennessee State Library. You're welcome to go look at them anytime you like. And the first issue of the Gazette, my eyes honed in on items such as this one. This is a runaway slave ad, and if you've ever looked at old newspapers, you see them. And I just started looking at it, and there was something that caught my eye, and that is, if you read it carefully, it says, I expect, this is a slave who ran away from Knox County. It says, I expect he will attempt to make for Maryland. Maryland? Why Maryland? I thought, why Maryland? So I was just getting kind of curious about that. Also, Little River, it says at the bottom, Little River, Knox County. I believe that's the little river that flows out of like the Smoky Mountains, the one that we normally associate with Gatlinburg, okay? Well, we don't normally think about runaway slaves. We think about Gatlinburg and Dollywood and Pigeon Forge. But anyway, so I thought that was interesting, and I kept looking. And then I found items such as this one. Here's a lottery. Before Tennessee was Tennessee, it was known as the Southwest Territory. Here's an advertisement for a private lottery, and some of the first prize was 5 valuable tracts of land. Second prize, 2 prime likely Negroes. Those are slaves. Okay, so Tennessee was having private lotteries, and one of the prizes was a slave. That was interesting. And then I found items such as this one. Someone is selling 2 lots in what is now downtown Knoxville for cash or a Negro. Slaves, as it turns out, were basically legal tender practically. And in this case, this person sounded like he would take a certain amount of money or a slave. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so I became particularly interested in the advertisements for Runaways. And I started I may have had too much time on my hands in this particular day, but I started looking, and next thing you know, I'd found about 20 of these things. 20 became 50. Well, so I ended up coming back to the State Library and looking through other early Tennessee newspapers, such as the Nashville Whig, which was being published in like the early 1800s, in which we still have all the copies of the Nashville Whig. The Jackson Gazette, which was an early West Tennessee newspaper that came out in, I think, 1824. I started looking at Memphis newspapers from when Memphis was young, and I started looking at the Hiwassee Journal, which was the first newspaper in southeast Tennessee, which was there before Chattanooga was. And next thing I know, 50 ads had become 100, 100 became 200, and next thing you know, I'm kind of getting obsessed with this, and I suddenly occurred to me that no one has ever done this before, at least best of my knowledge, no one has ever systematically gone through every newspaper printed in Tennessee and tried to find all of the runaway ads. I ended up finding, depending on how you count them, I found 906 separate ads. But if you count them differently, for example, if let's say an ad, you might have as many as 7 people who ran away together. If you count that as 7, I actually found more than 2,000. I counted for at least 2,000 slaves in the state of Tennessee that ran away and were documented in newspaper ads. These are just the ones that made the newspapers that we still have. We don't have all the newspapers. For example, Shelbyville, Tennessee, Shelbyville, Tennessee had as many people as Nashville in the 1830s. Nashville and Shelbyville were comparable. For some reason, we have almost no newspapers from Shelbyville. It's just a fluke of luck that we have Nashville. And so I didn't find everything. I just found kind of a lot of what we have. So I ended up putting all these in a chart. And, in the meantime, as you start looking at the runaway ads, you start finding other types of ads. And I don't know if, this doesn't appear to be coming out very clear, I guess. But if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, this is a little ad which you might find interesting. It says, Negroes for sale. The subscriber, this is from the year 1819, would like to sell 5 likely young Negroes. 2 boys, one 18, the other 20 years old, 3 girls, 10, 15, and 18 years old, applied to the subscriber living on Richland Creek. Well, wait a minute. We're on Richland Creek. Could be here. Could be where St. Thomas Hospital. The man's name is Z.W. Waters. Okay. And I also found this particular ad interesting because of the ad to the left and above it. First time the name Sam Houston ever appeared in a newspaper. Young attorney Sam Houston, setting up to practice law in Nashville. He went on to do other things than just practice law in Nashville. He's the only person he was the only person to resign as governor of 2 different states, Tennessee and Texas. In any case, it became very obvious based on all the questions I was finding. I needed to research some of this, and I ended up finding some books on the internet. There's a website called abooks.com. Probably shouldn't tell you this, but it's where all the old bookstores put their old books online, and I found a whole bunch of old books on there, including one on the far right called Slave Trading in the Old South, which told me all this about slavery and the slave trade that I didn't know. And also on the left, I found several first-person accounts of life in slavery in Tennessee that I'd never heard of. And probably the best one was this one by a man named the Reverend J.W. Logan. And I talk about him later in terms of something that's there. Oh, I forgot to do that column. The column, obviously, somewhere along the way, this became a lot more than a column. It ended up becoming a book, which is called Runaways, Coffles and Fancy Girls, and I had to organize it. So it's kind of organized based on different concepts that I learned. Like there's one chapter on how slavery broke up the family, and there's another chapter on the slave trade in Memphis. There's a chapter on the slave trade in Nashville, and et cetera. This is what the cover looks like. It's the most politically incorrect book cover ever printed. When I gave a copy to David Briley when he first became mayor, and I caught myself walking through the Metro Courthouse sort of hiding it because it's like, whoa, who the heck are you? And but you know, I didn't have any choice. There really are very few, if any, photographs of slaves. There were photographs of people who were slaves in their childhood that were taken in the 1870s or 1880s, but people didn't really take a lot of photographs of slaves. For one thing, photographs were expensive, and but it's something that's mainly documented in newspapers. Okay, general points about slavery advertising. First of all, I found it in practically every newspaper published in Tennessee prior to the Civil War. There were no profitable newspapers that refused to publish them, even in East Tennessee. Notice the word profitable. Okay. Most of the ads of all types ran between 4 and 12 times. This ends up being important because newspapers in antebellum Tennessee were 4 pages and were generally weekly. So if you do the math, you realize, I discovered this, I could skip 3 issues. In fact, I did this a lot. I would look at the February 1st issue, and then I'd jump to the February 22nd issue, and some of the exact same ads are right there. And so I eventually learned, this ended up being important because I'd still be down there. If newspapers were every day 32 pages, this would have taken a lot longer than it did. As it was, it took too long, and as it was, I probably lost my mind a little bit. My favorite anecdote of this regard we had like one major snow of last year, and it hit around lunchtime. And I remember I was sitting in the state library working, and somebody came in and said, "You're going to have to go." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we're closing down." And I said, "Well, it's already 5 o'clock." And they said, "No, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon." And I said, "Well, why do I have to go?" They said, "Because we're closing." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because it's snowing." And I said, "Well, just leave the key. I'll shut the door behind me." I mean, what is the problem? I said, "Well, Trey Hargett said," "I don't care what Trey Hargett says. Just give me the key." Okay, in any case, in regards to the runaway ads, I logged the name of the slave, the name, I was very systematic about this, the name of the home county of the slave holder, the newspaper and the date of publication, the slave's special skills, and I'll talk about that in a second, comments about the slave's appearance, scars, comments about the slave's behavior, and other items that made each ad unique. Okay, first, let me just give you a little bit of a primer on how to do this. Like, if any of you want to take this up, let me give you a few points that will help you as you journey through the politically incorrect world of runaway slave ads in the early American history. First of all, on the top left are some words that I ran across that aren't frequently used in polite conversation in the year 2018. Does everybody know what the word mulatto means? Okay, we don't use that word very much. If anyone here was under the age of 20, they'd say, "I've never heard that word." But people here know what that word means. How about yellow? Yellow does not mean Chinese, okay? They might describe a slave as yellow. That means that I guess they're mostly white, okay? That their skin is almost yellow in appearance, but you see that a lot. The next one kind of took me by surprise because, you know, when I go to football games and my guy makes a quarterback sack, I stand up and yell, "That's my man!" Well, I don't know if the use of that phrase goes back before slave times, but in slave times, my man meant your slave, okay? A lot of times these ads will say, "Ran away from my plantation, my man Bob." And it comes a lot. So it's one of the phrases that you frequently see, "My man Harry," "my man so-and-so," okay? The word likely doesn't mean now what it used to mean. It comes up a lot in these things. The word likely means good. My man Bob, a likely Negro, means he's a good slave. Okay, but the word likely is in a lot of these ads. Apply at the printer is a phrase that totally threw me for the loop. Here's, on the right, you'll see, you may not be able to read it very well. On the right, it says, "For sale or hire, a young Negro girl, da-da-da," and then it says, "Inquire at this office." Or then it might say, another one might say, "Apply at the printer." I could not figure what that meant. The first time I saw it, I thought it meant that the Knoxville Gazette was selling slaves. Wow, they own slaves, but that's not what it meant. It means if you're interested in buying this person, come down to the office, leave a note, and the person who ran this ad will get back to you. Okay? Again, why? Well, this was explained to me in that book about slave trading in the Old South. Why would a person not want to reveal that they're selling a slave in the newspaper publicly? Well, that's one theory, that they didn't want the slave to know. That's pretty legitimate, but I don't think that's the reason, I concluded. It's because the sale of a slave was an admission that you were destitute in the Old South. It was an admission that things weren't going well, that the price of cotton had gone down, that you needed money, okay? And so proper people didn't, it was something that you were embarrassed about. And so but the other thing about this is when it says apply at the printer, what that suddenly made me realize that the newspapers were really an agent in this transaction. And they all were. Every newspaper in Tennessee was basically like a real estate agent for slaves. And this is one of the first things that hit me when I was looking at this, like, wow, you don't really think about this. But, oh, and by the way, some of the newspapers today are the same ones that were before then. I don't want to be told this, but the Tennessean claims that it goes back to like 1820, but if they saw this presentation, they'd suddenly probably change their mind. Say, no, we go back to 1933 when anyway, okay, the expression fancy girl, it doesn't come up in many of these ads, but it came up in a few. A fancy girl is a slave that was sold as a concubine, a physically attractive slave who is worth more than somebody who's out in the fields or as a carpenter. She does something that makes her more valuable. Y'all understand what I'm talking about? Okay, fancy girls were generally associated with New Orleans. They often were leased out to work on steamboats as prostitutes. And they would sell for extremely high amounts of money. Okay, and I'm not the first person to discover this, but they are mentioned in newspaper ads in Nashville, Tennessee. There was one slave trader in particular who sold them at the corner of what is now 5th and Charlotte. Wait a minute, 5th and Martin Luther King, excuse me. But right across from St. Mary's Catholic Church, he would sell fancy girls as young as 13 years old. Okay. Coffle is a word that kind of comes up. It's in the title of my book. I probably didn't do the right thing to put this in the title of the book, but it's a very common word in the Old South. A coffle is a chain gang of slaves. And it was frequently used in the antebellum South, and then it vanished from the vernacular, and you generally don't see it. Okay, I want to talk a little about accepted notions that my book challenges. There's a few things that I have run across in history books and even kind of passed on. And now I'm not saying they're wrong, but I really kind of question whether we should go back and rethink a lot of these things. First of all, since Tennessee has and I have this photograph because this is me and a group of teachers at an event I did, and everybody's white because we're in East Tennessee. Okay, just so you know, if I'm speaking to a group of teachers, I can usually tell by looking at the audience which part of the state I'm in. There's 40% of the counties in Tennessee have practically no black people. And I can usually tell, I must be in Sullivan County. I must be in, well, here I am. And when you go to these parts of the state, they'll tell you that, oh, we didn't have slaves here, you know. But that's one of the things I've kind of begun to question. Since Tennessee had a smaller percentage of slaves than states like South Carolina, slavery was less entrenched here than in other states. I'm not sure if I'll pass that one on anymore. Certainly, institutionally, it appears as if there wasn't a whole lot different here than like in Georgia, legally, institutionally. This is one that I'm really, this phrase, you'll see this sentence. Tennessee had a burgeoning emancipationist movement. We had some very brave abolitionists, and some of them were very public in the 1820s, but, you know, they had to be pretty brave. But movement, when you think about movement, what does that imply? If there's a movement today, civil rights movement, a lot of people doing stuff publicly. When you find out what the laws were in Tennessee, you realize if there was a movement, these were some brave people. Because as I'll talk to you about in a second, it was illegal to write anything in Tennessee that was against slavery. You would go to jail for writing an op-ed piece against slavery, okay? So this is one that is a pet peeve of mine. There's a marker in downtown Nashville that says, this home is a house across from the arena, and there's a bar in it now, a restaurant, and it claims to be it's an old house. The house has been there for a very long time, since the early 1800s, and there's a marker out front. It's not a state marker, it's just a marker somebody put out there that says, this was a well-known stop on the Underground Railroad. There were no well-known stops on the Underground Railroad. It's a secret network. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. There was no such thing. But there certainly weren't here, maybe in Boston. So that's just wrong. And yet, those $70 walking tours you get on the Segway, they'll tell you, yeah, that's... And then the other thing, the Emancipation Proclamation and how slaves were freed, it's a very complicated story. But Tennessee was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, and we've always known that, but I've never quite been exposed to evidence that shows we really were exempt. They were still selling slaves at the courthouses in East Tennessee in 1863, okay? And so Sevier County, I found sales at the courthouse. And so the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't free slaves in this state. Points I would like to emphasize: slavery was deeply embedded in Tennessee, more than people realize. Number two, the separation of slave families was not only common, but it was publicly done, openly done, and documented by court officials at the courthouse. They're called Chancery Court Clerk and Masters. And this was a big part of what they all did before 1865. Number three, agriculture wasn't the only part of our economy tied to slavery. Every part of our economy was tied to slavery. Number four, state and local governments had a very cozy relationship with slavery. Number five, there are aspects of the slave trade that are so horrifying that they've been buried in history. And I'll talk about some of those in a second. As far as embedding, in spite of the fact this is a cited statistic that I think is pretty true. Only one in four white households own slaves. Okay, when you hear that and just stop there, you then say, well, wait a minute, why did we fight the Civil War? 75% don't own. What are we doing here? Okay, well, first of all, it was deeply connected to law enforcement, the judicial system, transportation, religion. Also, and this is important distinction, it may be that only 1 in 4 white households own slaves, but a quick look through old newspapers makes it very clear that many households leased slaves. Now, the leasing of slaves is not as well documented at the courthouse as the owning, but let me ask you a quick question. Is anyone in this room who leases a car? Okay, there's a few people. Y'all support the driving of automobiles on roads? So it really doesn't matter that you lease, does it? You still drive. Anyone here have a car you're still making car payments on? So the bank actually still owns the car, okay? Okay, I mean, then the rest of you are all paid your bills, own it outright? Yeah, okay. So usually in an audience, about half the hands go up. Well, buy a car, lease a car, still paying off the car, you still drive a car, okay? And a lot of people and a lot of businesses leased slaves. You'll see it. There are, it was an investment strategy to own, and what you, let's say that, here's something that you probably know. There were churches in Virginia that owned slaves, okay? And some of you may know this, but they didn't own slaves because they had an enormous amount of yard work that needed to be done. They owned slaves because they farmed them out as an investment strategy. And if you did this wisely, it was a brilliant investment, okay? Better than gold, better than whatever else you could buy in the year 1840. Leasing is a whole other world about how you would lease out slaves, and you might lease them across town. You might lease them to a railroad that's 200 miles from here. You might lease them, so there's all sorts of different options there. More on embedded, law enforcement. If you were in law enforcement, enforcing the slave laws was a big part of your job. You had no option. Law enforcement in every county was geared to arrest runaways. They arrested them all the time and constantly ran ads pointing out that they had arrested them. This was a part of Tennessee law. They had to run these ads. Once arrested, these runaways remained in jail until they were claimed. While there, they were set to work, and you see them all over the county in chains like a chain gang. Let me ask a logical question. Which part of Tennessee, let's say that you're a county in East Tennessee that didn't have a lot of slaves comparatively compared to West Tennessee. Did you have runaways coming through there? Yes, you did. Think about where East Tennessee is and how it's a straight line between Georgia and North. So in fact, in places like Hancock County, you might have more runaways coming through there than you would in Nashville. So you see these ads. These are actually more prevalent than the actual runaway ads, with these ads where they would say that we've apprehended so-and-so. Interesting question. They would always say, we've apprehended this man. He says his name is Bob. He says he belongs to Colonel Jones, who lives on the Mississippi River, blah, blah, blah. How'd they get Bob to talk? Okay, Bob just start talking? Yeah, beat up Bob a little bit, right? I mean, when I can't get over, whenever you see these, they're always telling you who this person is. I always think, they sure talk quickly. But, you know, a sheriff in Tennessee in the year 1850 could no more be against slavery than a sheriff in Tennessee today could be in favor of legalized crack. There's no part of the state that had a sheriff that was, I'm not going to capture these. No, it was part of your job, okay? And again, so now we have law enforcement. Chancery court, oh boy. This one took me a little by surprise. I didn't realize this, but you'll see these ads in practically every newspaper. Chancery court clerk. Slavery was absolutely embedded in the legal system. The most consistent slave traders in the state, providing the professionals with a constant flow of slaves, were the government officials, most notably Chancery court clerk and masters. If you look in the newspapers, you will always see these. In this case, a place called Smith's Crossroads in Ray County is selling, the Chancery court clerk, whose name is James Berry, is selling 22 slaves on this day, and if you had gone, you would have seen these, and these were big events. This was probably the most interesting thing happening at Smith's Crossroads, Ray County. By the way, Smith's Crossroads is now called Dayton. I checked. Here's a couple more of these things. Here's one on the left is a place called Franklin, Tennessee. 1852, the following slaves, Lily and her children, whose names are Marie, Marianne, Jackson, Henrietta, Betsy, and Eliza. Don't know whether they were all sold together. Don't know. On the right is you can't read that one, but it's in a place called Fayetteville. And if you read it, the first Monday in January 1858, the clerk and master was selling at the courthouse 64 slaves in Lowell, Fayetteville. It's a lot for Fayetteville, okay? I was able to document, just me, 162 times when slaves were sold at the courthouses of different parts of the state, and I probably only found a fourth of them. In Davidson County, I probably found 12 of these, and yes, they were more often than not sold at the courthouse. And what's interesting about it is it makes you, how many courthouses, there's 95 counties in Tennessee. Does anyone know how many courthouses predate the Civil War? There's 6. That means slaves were sold at all 6 of those buildings. Okay, Dixon County got the oldest courthouse. That's great. But guess what? Okay, Williamson County, oldest, built before the Civil War. Guess what? That means slaves were sold there. Okay, and by the way, since my book came out, there's talk of putting a marker down there that acknowledges this, and the Daughters of the Confederacy don't like it at one bit. There's a big to-do down there. Okay, moving on to separation of slave families. From statehood until about 1860, there was something passed in 1860. There was no law in Tennessee that required or even encouraged slaveholders, whether they be private citizens or court officials, to make any effort to sell slave families together or even to sell small children together with their mothers. Because of this, it is a certainty that every slave trader and every chancery court clerk and master separated slave families at these courthouse sales. You can find evidence of family breakups in many places, starting with the runaway ads if you read them carefully. Here's one for a slave who ran away from Montgomery County near the Yellow Creek Iron Works, which I guess is an industrial operation up there. And it said in here that he was almost certainly headed in the direction of his old master, whose name was Thomas Titsworth of Sullivan County. Well, where's Sullivan County? It's like northeast Tennessee. Well, what, is he lost? No. Why is he going to Sullivan County? Well, what's the only possible explanation for this? It's where his family was, okay? That's about 100 of these ads. Most of the time, you would think they wouldn't even need to say, oh, he's headed toward the Ohio River. Where else could he be going? No, a lot of times they're not heading toward the Ohio River. Here's one from Scott County, Tennessee, and it says here, his wife belongs to E.M. Dunn of Benton, Polk County, Tennessee. So he may be heading there. Well, if he is heading there, he's heading much deeper into the south than he already was. Polk County is east of Chattanooga. Well, he's going to see his wife. Here's one in a place called Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And he also has, let's see here, slightly ranch, was raised in Williamson County, Tennessee. His mother belonged to the widow Maxwell of Davidson County. His father is a free man of black color and is named Alfred, and I am informed lives in the neighborhood of Mrs. Maxwell. He also has some children in the neighborhood of Huntsville, Alabama. And I have reason to believe he has been harboring, anyway, there's no telling where this guy will go, but we seem to have a road map of his lineage here, okay? And if we need any more evidence of slaves sold away from their families, this just happened to run in a national publication in 1859. Can y'all see this? This is interesting because it even says this was at a slave sale at a place called Lebanon, Tennessee. And it even talks about how much each person was sold for. And I'm going to start with with what was considered, and I'm aware of what demographic I'm talking to here, okay? 60-year-old man, how much did he sell for? Can y'all see that? $100. That's not very much money. Why is a 60-year-old man worthless in the eyes of his? When you see these other amounts, his whole life is, there's not much of a life ahead of him, theoretically, I guess. Emmeline, 7-year-old girl, $1,051. John, 14 years old, $1,575. Here's Paralee, who is 22, is sold. She's being sold here with 2 small children, $2,300. And the other one, here's another, there's 2 Emmelines. This Emmeline is 25 years old, unsound, $700. It took me forever to figure out what unsound meant. Can anyone guess? Yes, ma'am. She can't have children. a woman who can't have children that's unsound, okay? But anyway, but it's interesting but it also shows that this Emmeline was 7 years old and sold away. So this is a 7-year-old girl being sold totally by herself. So if she had a family, she doesn't have it anymore. Okay, so we don't really need, so I think we all probably could, everybody knew that this was happening, but I don't think I realized how clearly documented it is in the newspapers. Perhaps the best first-person account of a slave trade in Tennessee I found came from a man named William Fletcher, who later wrote his memoirs, and I want to read this. This is the only part of the book that I'm going to read out loud. This is a pretty respectable man. This is not fake news. And he's describing a slave sale that he saw in a place called Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 1851. And by the way, according to his account, there were 300 people at this event. That's a lot for Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 1851. They don't get that many for MTSU football games anymore. Okay, the most remarkable case was that of a woman about 30 years old who was being put on a block outside the courthouse wall with a crowd of 200 or 300 men standing around and a red-faced, burly auctioneer standing by her side. She held a young babe in her arms. The auctioneer made various comments as to her appearance and showed her off in a very unbecoming style, making her show her teeth, and in other ways treating her as if she were a horse. Coarse men came up and felt her limbs to test what kind of muscles she had. It was the most disgusting performance we had ever witnessed. The auctioneer seemed to pride himself in his rough language and becoming treatment of the woman. She bore the indignities with a certain air of dignity. Her husband was in the crowd near where my brother and I stood, and near him was his owner. There were two bidders actively bidding for her, one the owner of her husband, and the other a slave driver who shipped slaves to the cotton fields of the South. As the bidding progressed, the husband of the wife pleaded with his owner in a most plaintive way to buy his wife. As we stood by, we heard him say, quote, "I have been faithful in my serving you, and if I had my wife and children with you, you know that I could serve you even better." His owner seemed to bid carelessly, while the slave trader on the other side of the crowd seemed to bid with more interest. As the bidding progressed, the husband kept pleading with his owner in a most touching manner to bid more. My brother and I, standing together, got so wrought up that we thought it prudent to step apart, lest we should utterly break down and show our sympathies and get into serious trouble. The bidding went on for a half hour, all the time the owner of the husband bidding with little interest and making only slight advances over to the other man, and the other bidding with apparent purpose of securing the woman. Finally, the mother and child were sold to the slave trader. So this guy's describing one sale of one woman and her child in Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 1851. This happened all over the state, and this was, I'm not even sure based on that whether this was the Chancery Court Clerk and Master or someone the Chancery Court Clerk and Master had hired. I'm not really sure, but anyway. In case you're wondering, other states, and this is interesting, Mississippi and Louisiana both had laws against selling a woman away from her small child, but Tennessee didn't. Tennessee's laws were actually tougher or less sympathetic to the slave than those of Mississippi and Louisiana. And every so often I would find that some legislator had proposed a new law that we should adopt the law that they had in those other states. And the newspapers would all come down very, very harsh on the legislator. And here's one of the editorials, and I won't read the whole thing, but the summary sentence is the last one. It says, "It is as unnecessary as it is perilous to tamper with the relation of master and slave." So newspapers, and so Tennessee was pretty harsh. And again, what we teach that our slavery wasn't as harsh in Tennessee, okay? Well, okay, moving on. Other things that I kind of gathered from all this data I collected. Agriculture wasn't the only thing dependent on slavery. So was construction, so was industry, so was the development of Tennessee's infrastructure, so was transportation, and so was banking. Any bankers in the room? No one's going to raise their hand. There's three of you in here, because people were shocked when I said, banking? What does banking have to do with it? Well, just wait and you see. Okay. Construction. In many of these ads, it references a special skill or occupation of the slave. And a couple of the ones that come up a lot are carpenter, painter, plasterer, stonemason, bricklayer. Here's one over here, William Massengil of Dandridge, Tennessee, and it says that one of the people who ran away was a bricklayer, plasterer, and painter. And it has pretensions as a barber. I wonder what that means, pretension. In other words, he thinks he can cut hair, but he really can't. Anyway, so that's Jefferson County. That's East Tennessee. Here's one on the top right, Thomas K. Handy of Franklin, Tennessee, looking for a man named Albert who was taken off. It says, said boy can read and write and is something of an engineer, having worked at a cotton factory. Okay. James Bell in the bottom right-hand corner, a slaveholder who lives in Davidson County. I love this sentence. It says, this person has run away. His name is Nat. And it says, has a fiddle under his arm and is a carpenter by trade. Okay. Now, if they are a carpenter, what does that tell us? It tells us that they're farmed out. They're hired out. Because there is no way that any one person can have enough work for one person. So what that means is they're farmed out. They're hired out. They work for a construction company. Does anyone here own a house built before 1865? I have a friend who just bought a house built in 1837 in Columbia. And what's interesting is we can gather that there's a very good chance that slave labor helped build that house. Okay? It's about a block, by the way, Dan, from where they want to put James K. Polk's body, which probably may or may not happen. But okay, industry. Now, we don't normally think about heavy industry in the South. We didn't have industry, did we? Well, we had a guy named Montgomery Bell. Okay, Montgomery Bell purchased at least 7 runaway slave ads, and he had a pretty interesting heavy industrial operation northwest of here that mined iron and smelted iron and made into pig iron to be shipped to other markets where it was made into things like nails and utensils and weapons and cannonballs, and a lot of it was slaves. In fact, here's an ad, ran away from Worley Furnace, Dixon County, Tom, an engineer. Tom was an engineer. And then someone named Jim, who's a blacksmith. And I can't resist. Let me read you part of this ad. It's really something. It says, it is supposed that 2 low white women left the neighborhood about the same time and that the boys may be in company with them. Low white women, okay. But anyway, Montgomery Bell was not a farmer. And he had a very heavy operation, industrial operation. And the top right is an ad for something called the Cumberland Saline, which is salt works in Jackson County. And they would run ads all the time. They were looking to hire, in this case, 20 or 30 strong Negro men to work at the Cumberland Saline. This is in year 1817. On the bottom right are 2 ads that I found in the Nashville newspapers. One for people to work in an iron factory called Baxter, Hicks, and Ewing, looking for 30 Negro men. And below them is a bag factory owned by David Williams and William Bosworth, looking to hire 10 to 12 Negro men and boys to be employed in a bagging factory. These are just small numbers. There's a whole lot more, but this is the interesting thing. So slave labor worked in factories. Okay, now if you think about this, let's say that you had a factory and had 80 people working it and 40 of them are slaves. What does that allow you to do to the wages of the other 40 that aren't slaves? Okay. It means that if one thing, if you act up, I can replace you with a slave. Okay, so, it's just something to sort of keep in mind. Transportation, steamboats, all had slaves working on them in different occupations, porters, firemen, all sorts of jobs. Here's 2 of the steamboats, one called the Old Hickory and one called the Steamboat Red Rover. And they would go away, and one of the things that crossed my mind when I think about this, slave labor being hired as steamboat, wouldn't you be afraid that the person would run away? Well, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't you run away? I'm working on the Red Rover steamboat. Well, for one thing, you might get caught, and then you probably wouldn't be working on the Red Rover steamboat anymore, okay? You might get sent to Mississippi, and you've got a much harsher job. The other thing is you might not see your family again because they're living in Tennessee, okay? At least those are the 2 reasons I eventually came up with. But this was very common. In fact, it was so common that there's something called, that people would buy insurance. You'll see these ads in the newspaper. If you had slaves, you would buy marine hazard insurance. It says also Negroes against the dangers of the river. You would buy this in case, you fell overboard. Because not to ask the obvious question, but would slaveholders teach their slaves to swim? since the main boundary between slave and free territory was a large, wide river? Probably not, okay? So, infrastructure development. When the railroads came, they hired large numbers of slaves. They didn't just hire slaves, okay? Don't get me wrong. There are other people that they hired. But at the top is an ad for the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, which was the first big one around here. And it says that they are looking to hire, and this is a pretty interesting ad. Donald Trump would not like this ad, okay? Because they're looking to hire 1,000 immigrants out of 2,000 people. Irish laborers, that means immigrants. They wouldn't call them Irish laborers if they weren't immigrants, okay? That's 1,000. And then it's 500 Negroes, those are slaves. And then 500 native-born laborers. What's a native-born laborer? It's a white guy, okay? So 3 out of 4 jobs go to either an immigrant or a slave. So this is, do y'all remember when the guy from Alabama ran, and he said we were a more moral country in he actually said 18. Well, you know, this was happening then. I mean, you know, anyway, and here's another one in the lower right-hand corner for the Cleveland and Chattanooga Railroad. Has anyone ever been rafting on the Hiwassee River? Yeah, that's the railroad that goes right by there. This is, I think that's the railroad that goes by there. They were looking for 100 Negroes to work there. Okay, banks. Yeah, there's a banker in this room. I just know there is. Banks were absolutely in up to their necks. Some people think, well, I'll be a banker. I don't have to be pro-slavery if I'm a banker. Yes, you do. Because banks were up to their necks in slavery. They loaned, first of all, when people bought slaves, they didn't pay cash for them any more than people pay cash for houses today. When you look at ads for slave auctions, they'll even have the name of the bank right there, and they'll even say, you know, 25% down and the other 75% over 3 years, okay? Which means that the banks technically banks had full-time people whose entire job it was to deal with the slaves on the balance sheets, okay? The second thing is that slaveholders would use slaves as escrow whenever they borrowed money to buy more land. Let's say that you own 400 acres in Fayette County, and you're doing great. The price of cotton is going up, and you're looking at that other 400 acres next door to you. It turns out your neighbor dies. You want to buy it. Has anyone here ever been to the bank to borrow money to do anything? And then and only then learned what escrow is? I have. And I got to tell them, look, if I had $20,000, I wouldn't need to borrow $20,000 now, would I? So anyway, but they used, what was the most common thing to use as escrow in the South? It was slaves. What else could you use? Okay, now, let's say you own 40 slaves. Which ones are you gonna write down as escrow? The 60-year-old man or the 7-year-old girl? The 7-year-old girl, because she's worth $1,675. You can't. 60-year-old man is not even worth writing his name. He's worth $100, and he may die next year. The 7-year-old. So, do you go home and tell them? Do you gather them all together and say, y'all little? No. Why do they need to know, right? Everything's fine unless the price of cotton goes down. In which case, you lose those slaves, and they're sold at the courthouse steps. And that's why when you look at the ads that the Chancery Court clerk and masters bought, there's a large proportion of the people sold that were children. That's why, because they were worth so much money. And I hate to say it, but the more you think about slavery, the more you realize if you're a slaveholder, every time one of your female slaves has a child, your value just went up. Your ability to borrow more money, buy more land just went up. Okay, okay, and if there's any doubt about the banking thing, I've read history books that will claim that people in the South look down on slave traders. I don't believe a word of it, okay? I don't believe one word of it. That's not true. Nathan Bedford Forrest wouldn't have been elected city council in Memphis, and he was, if people looked down on slave traders, but this proves it. This is a slave yard called Glover and Boyd, one of the many slave traders that came and went in Nashville, and it has this nice ad in the paper, and it lists references, and there is no one in this room who could put together a list of references this good. Not even Dan Pomeroy could put together a list of references this good. Maybe he could, I don't know. Because here we go. First reference, the governor of Tennessee. The second reference, the ex-governor of Tennessee. I got Bredesen and Haslam, okay? Then we have named John Shelby of a bank called Wellis and Hobson, a bank called Dyer Pearl and Company, a bank called D. Shepherd and Company. Someone named Colonel V.K. Stevenson. I've heard of him. He was the founder of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. Stevenson, Alabama is named for that man. Here's another banker, the Cashier Bank of Tennessee, the Planters Bank of Tennessee. Oh, there's the clerk and master of Chancery Court. What a surprise. And so here we go. This is a heck of a list of references. This is a slave trader. This is a big-time slave trader in downtown Nashville. So if somebody says in the Old South books, oh, we all look down on slave traders. Well, not this one. Okay, not these governors. State and local governments had a cozy relationship with slavery, and they really have never really come clean about this. First of all, a couple of things about state law that really took me by surprise. I don't think this is an exaggeration, but in Tennessee, when it came to slavery, there was no First Amendment rights, okay? It was legal in the 1820s to write abolitionist literature, and there were a couple of newspapers in East Tennessee in the 1820s. But in 1836, a law was passed, and I'm guessing the Nat Turner Rebellion may have had something to do with it, that basically said that anything that is written that is calculated to excite discontent, insurrection, or rebellion amongst the slaves is illegal. Okay, now that's a pretty broad definition. Is Uncle Tom's Cabin, could that be calculated to excite discontent, insurrection, and rebellion? Yes. How about Frederick Douglass's newspaper? Yes. How about any abolitionist newspaper? Okay. Now, this law not only says that it's illegal to write them, it says that it's illegal to circulate them. The postman will go to jail if he delivers a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin to your house. This is Tennessee in the 1840s. So when so that's why I'm saying, okay, where is this burgeoning emancipationist movement? It would have been seriously, these people would have had to have some serious guts. And I'm not saying there weren't abolitionists, but they were certainly a minority, and they were brave people. Other things that are kind of obvious about slavery: slaves had no standing in court and could not testify against or bring charges against a slaveholder. That's a pretty important point. It was legal to beat a slave, abuse a slave, and even rape a slave. I say that because there's no laws against it. There's no law that says you can't rape a slave, okay? There was a law, however, that says it is illegal to beat the slave of another person, which I thought was interesting. Take those three words at the end, add a meaning to it. But why is that? Yeah, the same reason it's illegal for me to take a baseball bat and hit your car. I can beat mine all I want, but the second I dent your car, oh boy, okay? And so this is Tennessee law. And by the way, I got all this from a man named Eddie Weeks. We got out the Tennessee Code from 1858, and he has it in this cabinet, and we had to wear gloves and everything. It was really quite an exciting moment when we opened it. And he said, now don't lick your fingers after you've touched this thing. And I said, why? And he goes, don't do it. Okay, state capital. Whenever possible, governments use slave labor to keep costs down. Governments like to keep costs down, right? Okay, for example, William Strickland is the architect of the Tennessee State Capitol. These ads run in the paper all throughout the 1840s. They're looking to hire 10 to 12 able-bodied Negroes for quarrying and hoisting stone for the building. So there were slaves working on the Tennessee State Capitol. I don't think that comes as a huge shock to anyone, but I've not seen that written a lot over the years. And I haven't seen this ever written. One of them died. And we know this because I found this little item in the newspaper. We learned that a sad accident happened on Saturday about noon at the Capitol Quarry. A Negro man belonging to a Mr. Baldwin, whilst at work there, received a blow from a lever by some mismanagement which broke his spine. You know what's weird about that ad? The slave has no name. Baldwin does, but the slave doesn't. And I just stumbled across this. I don't think this may or may not have ever been found before. I don't know. This one has taken a couple of people by surprise. The state of Tennessee used to hold lotteries, anything to keep from having to raise taxes, okay? And in 1836, they had a lottery to raise money for what was called internal improvements, which I think means roads and maybe dredging rivers so people could use the rivers better. But in this lottery, there were some valuable prizes you could win, and at the top of the list is a farm on Mill Creek. And then there's a I can't read it all here. I guess y'all can't read either. But it's mainly pieces of land, and there's a couple of steamboats down here. There's some land in Dyer County. Well, who wants that, right? Okay. And then, but you get at the bottom, and then you can blow. Can y'all see that? There were 5 slaves. A Negro man named Charles, age 45. A yellow girl named Matilda, age 12. A Negro girl named Rebecca, age 11. A Negro woman named Nancy, age 43. A Negro girl named Maria, age 6. Okay, a man 45, woman 43, 3 kids aged 12, 11, and 6. Sound like a family of 5 to me. Okay, what we don't know is whether they were lotteried off together or separately. I don't know. Nobody knows. No one's ever dug this up before. This, I don't think so. Everyone in the room has gotten a phone call except me. Local governments often employed slave labor. This is the mayor of a place called Clarksville, and this is an ad I found. We're looking to hire slaves to work. But Nashville didn't always lease. Nashville owned. For reasons that I don't understand, Nashville purchased slaves. They purchased 26 of them. They did it in the fall of 1830. They paid a slave trader, and this is very well documented. They paid a slave trader $12,000. His name was William Ramsey. He went to Virginia. By the way, Ron Ramsey, the former lieutenant governor, is a friend of mine, and he's an auctioneer, and I couldn't resist. Is this a relative? No, I never heard of that guy. He went to Virginia, Maryland, purchased 24 slaves, brought them back to Nashville, probably in chains in a coffle. And if you go down to the Metro Archives and ask Ken Feith, he'll show you the logbook. It's about this big, and it even has incredible handwriting, the names, the descriptions, the places from which these people were all purchased, the price that was paid for them, everything. This is incredibly well documented. And but what happened to them is not well documented. For the best, we don't know what happened to these people. At least I don't. And I didn't discover this from Ken to begin with. I found, this wasn't hard to find, there's a runaway, twice the mayor of Nashville purchased runaway slave ads in the newspaper. And it would be at the top of the front page of the newspaper, these detailed ads that describe how the government bought these slaves and they ran away. This is a mayor named Sam Stout. And it goes into the description. The first sentence, run away from the corporation of Nashville, blah, blah, blah. And it goes into all this description. So that's how I discovered it. It wasn't anything hard. 5, there were horrifying aspects to the slave trade that have simply been buried, which generations of Southerners, I'm checking the time, oh my gosh. Are y'all worn out yet? Huh, I am. Okay, well, I'm gonna keep going. There are things about the slave trade that have simply been buried, which generation of Southerners, I think at some point Southerners just said, let's never talk about this. 1870, let's never discuss this again. Because some of this stuff, I'm reading this going, I can't believe this was happening. And for one thing, let me ask you this. When you visualize a slave trader, what do you think of that person as doing? I visualize that person auctioning off slaves at the courthouse, okay? Well, let me tell you, that was the easy part. Anybody could do that. That's the easy part. The good slave traders, the hard part was what led up to that. And what led up to that is if you were a slave trader, you would go from plantation to plantation, from house to house, and every 3 or 4 months make your rounds and go and say, sir, I'm Nathan Forrest from Memphis, and I want to see, is there anyone you'd like to sell this month? Would you like to sell any slaves? No, sir, not this month. Well, here's my card. If you ever want to sell any, you just come see me. They're like car dealers, okay? You just come see me if you ever want to sell that car. And they would do this, and about 5th time around, they would come and say, yeah, I'm thinking about selling. I'm thinking about selling about 8 slaves. Oh, well, then let's sit down and talk. Well, if you then go in the back and gather the 8 people who are going to be sold and tell them, they're not going to like that, are they? They're not just going to willingly go. They didn't do because, and so what you had to do is you had to surprise them. And the process of surprising them involved putting them in what's called a coffle. And let me read you 2 descriptions of a slave coffle. This is from a man named William Seward, who you've heard of before. He purchased the state of Alaska when he was the Secretary of State. And in his memoirs, he describes seeing a slave coffle in the state of Virginia. This was the moment he decided he was against slavery. A still sadder spectacle was that of a country tavern in Virginia where the carriage had arrived just at sunset. A cloud of dust was seen slowly coming down the road from which proceeded a confused noise of moaning, weeping, and shouting. Presently reaching the gate of the stable yard, it disclosed itself. 10 naked little boys between 6 and 12 years old, tied together 2 by 2 by their wrists, were all fastened to a long rope and followed by a tall, gaunt white man who with his long lash whipped up the sad and weary little procession, drove it to the horse trough to drink, and thence to a shed where they lay down on the ground and sobbed and moaned themselves to sleep. These were children gathered up at different plantations by the trader and were to be driven down to Richmond to be sold at auction and taken south. This is a slave. This is a coffle. This is what a coffle is. And I'm not going to, we're kind of running low on time here, but I mentioned J.W. Logan. J.W. Logan was born in a place called Manskers Creek. And when he was 8 years old, he describes in his memoirs how they got the slaves in the slave coffle when they were all being sold. And what happened was large men armed with revolvers and shackles would surround the slave cabin, burst in at 2 o'clock in the morning, and chain up the men before they knew what was going on. And chain up the women before, the strong-looking women before they knew what was going on, and get them into the coffle very quickly at gunpoint before the slaves had a chance to realize what was happening. And it was then and only then that the slaves realized, we're being sold. And these slaves were sold from real close to what's now Pope John Paul II High School, Manskers Creek, and they were marched right through downtown Nashville to a place called Murray County, where he then spent the next 13 years of his life before he escaped and before he ran away. Again, and something I want to mention, something you run across in ads was the sale of Fancy Girls in downtown Nashville. And there was one that some of these ads are just kind of creepy, but here's one that was just kind of creepy. This is also Reese W. Porter. I don't know if y'all can read that. One of the people being sold here, it says, one very pretty girl, 13 years old. Why do you care that she's pretty? Okay. So it's kind of creepy. Oh, I don't know what a fancy boy is. I have 2 or 3 theories, but I don't think it's I don't think it's a sex slave. And I'm not trying to be funny. I think it's somebody who would like a porter or a doorman. I think that's what it was, but I'm not sure. Because I have to, if you read the book, there's ads that mention fancy boy, and it makes it sound like it's the person who was your doorman or something. Have you ever seen those god-awful front yard ornaments that people in the South have? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to kind of run out of time a little bit, but I want to get to the new stuff I wrote for this presentation. What have I concluded and what would I like to see done? Number one, I recommend zero tolerance for the sentiment that slavery was humane and that the country was more moral than or whatever. This quote from Roy Moore, hopefully he was taken out of context. I mean, please. Maybe he wasn't. But there are people who every so often I'll be in the press. I actually... When this book first came out, I was stuck sitting next to a woman who had apparently written an entire book about the Old South, one of these romance novels. And she told me that when she heard I'd done a book about slavery, she said, well, you know, almost everybody in the South was against slavery. You know that, right? And I'm like, do you have any idea who you're talking to? And I sit with her for 3 hours. And she never stopped talking. Number two. Our government needs to stop misleading people by devoting money to causes which are more meant to generate tourism than they are to tell the truth. It may look harmless. For example, let's say that there's money devoted to the cause of researching the Underground Railroad, and just that, okay? Or if you think about it, what we're trying to do is build a tourism thing, build a case that this was bigger here than it really was. It may look harmless enough when research projects about the Underground Railroad and other exceptions to the norm are overemphasized, but years of this have created kind of fake news about history. For example, in the Tennessee Social Studies Standards, which I know very well, there's only one newspaper that's mentioned in K through 12 Social Studies Standards, 222 pages. Guess which it is? The Emancipator. The one abolitionist newspaper, which was printed in East Tennessee, which only survived 6 issues and then went bankrupt. There's no mention of the other 250 newspapers which all thrived off slavery. So we're now teaching an entire generation that the best known newspaper in Tennessee was the Emancipator, which is wrong, okay? And yet, but people kind of want history to be better. They kind of want that to. I'll mention something. One of the last places slaves were sold in Tennessee was, of all places, the train station in Nyota, Tennessee. And this is it. It's still standing. And I called the mayor of Nyota today. Nyota has only 600 people, so it's easy to get through to the mayor. And I thought of this because I've been meaning to call her. She had no idea. She works in this building. And I told her, I said, you know, y'all really, first of all, you need to get a historic marker. And I said, you may be able to get federal money to renovate that building because you may have the only train station in the South where slaves were sold. You know, and it's documented. It's in the newspaper, okay? And she was like, what newspaper? And so I'm sending it to her, to his honor or whatever. Okay, we do need more historic markers. This is one of my favorite markers in the state. Forest rested here. Okay, there are 32 state historic markers to Nathan Bedford Forest. 32. More than Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Andrew Johnson combined. Okay, and so we do tell that side of the story. Oh, I don't believe any of the state historic markers mention that he was in the slave trade. There's a new one in Memphis that was paid for by the Memphis taxpayers that does, but the state still we're still working on that. But we do need new markers that acknowledge all sorts of things like the private slave trade, the Chancery Court slave trade, the fact that a slave died in the construction of the state capitol, the fact that Nashville's government owned slaves. There's some things that need to be on markers. Because if we have enough markers that one says Forrest slept here, okay? And so, number 4, and this is something that fortunately I'm in a position to do something about, I suppose, but the way American history, Southern history, and Tennessee history is taught needs to be changed. Historically, slavery is hardly even mentioned except in a context of why we had the Civil War. A lot of the Tennessee history books, including the ones that I have written, will fall into this trap. We won't even talk about slavery until we start talking about why we had a Civil War. Well, we had slavery in 1800 and 1790. There were slaves in the Donaldson Party. Okay, so slavery was here from the beginning. And furthermore, we're now overemphasizing exceptions to the rule, such as an incident involving the Underground Railroad or emancipationist newspapers, to the point where every community at every part of the state seems to think that it didn't happen here. I met a superintendent of a school system the other day in Washington County. I was at and I mentioned something about the slave trade, and he goes, well, we didn't have that in Elizabethton. And I said, yes, you did. And he said, what do you mean? I said, and I pulled it as an ad in here. There was a big-time slave trader in Elizabethton. He lived there, but he did most of his trading in else, and he specialized in buying slaves from who were living in East Tennessee and shipping them to West Tennessee, and there was a big market in that. And he was dumbfounded. He'd even heard of this guy because he used to be one of the owners of the of an old home that's still standing in Johnson City, and I can't remember the name of it. But he was shocked, and he's the superintendent of the schools. So I guess he's probably as knowledgeable as about many others. Oh, let me go back to this. This is a cover of one of my own booklets, and I love that painting. And the artist is a great man, and I appreciate him letting me use his painting. What's interesting is what's missing from this painting. This is a settlers coming through the Cumberland Gap painting. There's no black people in this painting. But there really were black people from the earliest times, you know. And so, did you give you some idea of how far we have to go in this area? In the brand new U.S. history standards for 8th grade, there are no standards that require the teacher to actually teach what slaves did. There are standards about slaves resisting, but none about what slavery really was, okay? And in those same standards, we talk about Elihu Emery and his short-lived Emancipator newspaper, which is an interesting story, but it shouldn't be the only newspaper that we talk about. We need to point out, here's a few things we need to point out, that slaves were there from the start of Tennessee history. A slave died in the Donaldson Party journey. The first person who died in the Donaldson Party journey was a slave. He froze to death around present-day Knoxville. Slaves, I found an ad in the Nashville newspaper, or in West Tennessee newspapers. A slave had run away from what's called I think it was called the 4th Chickasaw Bluff, and that later became Memphis. So in other words, there is a runaway slave ad. A slave ran away in Memphis before it was even called Memphis, okay? So it was from the beginning. Slave labor helped build everything from railroads to roads, from clearing trees to laying foundations, from mining rock for the state capitol to digging rock that built the railroad tunnel under the Cumberland Plateau. Slavery was part of banking, newspapers, retail, church life, everything. It wasn't just something that rich people had, okay? Slave labor is how the South kept taxes low. People in the South love their low taxes. Well, let's go back to how it started. Of course we had lower taxes because Vermont didn't have slave labor, okay, and we did. And slavery is the main reason that in the South the rich were richer and the poor were poorer than in other parts of the country. Because if you owned a factory, a cotton mill in Nashville, Tennessee, you could have some slaves. You could have half your occupants, or maybe all of them, as slaves. You don't have to pay them as much. You know, they're not asking for minimum wage or health care or whatever it is those other people ask for, right? And slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. That sentence alone infuriates people in the year 2018. Oh, it had nothing to do with it. Okay. States' rights. Yeah, states' rights have slavery. Finally, even now, 6 months after my book came out, there is still, and I'm picking on the Democratic Party here, okay? The reason I am is because everybody, when we think about this, we think about Trump. But guess what? In the city of Nashville, with the Democratic mayor completely controlled, there's still no interest in the fact that the government of Nashville used to own slaves. Why? Perhaps it's because it would hurt our image as an it city if this came out. I mean, seriously, we're getting all this free press in the Wall Street Journal. We're an it city. What if it came out that Nashville used to own slaves? Well, so what if it does? But I've been trying to get the mayor, the vice mayor, anybody to look into this. What happened to these 26 people? I mean, seriously, apparently one of them worked for apparently they were all originally hired to build the waterworks, and at least one of them remained an employee of the waterworks until 1896. Carol Kaplan, who used to work at the Nashville room, told me that she'd researched this. He got a certificate that said he had worked for the water department for 61 years. The first 31 as a slave, and the last 31 as a free person. But so there is a story here, and Nashville really needs to document this, because it was absolutely not unusual for a city to hire slaves to farm them out. But I think it was kind of unusual for a city to own them, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, I'm done. I do have books, copies of the book that I'll be selling later. Are there any questions? Nope, none. Good, thank God. Oh, yes, there is one. Yes, sir.
So was Mandy mentioned the only way the slave could become free, and in that regard, what was their relationship to whites and to slaves?
Well, there are books. There were interviews that were done. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I do know this. I've read many of the first-person accounts of people who were slaves who were interviewed like in the 1920s and 1930s by FISC researchers and by the federal government. And there's things you run across. Remember I told you how people would farm out their slaves? There were some situations where a slaveholder would go to the slave and say, look, I'm going to farm you out, and if you do this for 10 years, I'm going to let you, and if you don't run away, you're a free man. And sometimes they would be honest and they would do it. And this is how some slaves bought their freedom. There was at least one case where a man worked for what's called the Nashville Inn, which is a hotel, and he did it, and he became free. And then he had to buy his wife's freedom, and then they had to buy their child's freedom. It took them like 15 years, but that was known to happen. And as it turns out, though, the one thing about once you become free, and this is kind of weird stuff, there were a lot of laws restricting the fraternization of free blacks and slaves. They could not, I think the law said if you were a free black person, you couldn't be at a slave's quarters after dark, okay? Now, if your daughter was a slave and you were free, this gave you a lot of trouble. And one of the most bizarre state laws that existed, and existed for a reason, was a law that allowed a person who was a slave to petition a person who was a free black person could petition to become a slave again. When I first read this, I couldn't believe it. It turns out it's been done. Didn't you and I talk about this, Dan? Right. Yeah. There are incidents of people who were free black people who went back to becoming a slave, and I think the reason was so they could see their family, because the life of a free African American person was very restricted, like a Jew in Nazi Russia. Okay, excuse me, in Nazi Germany. There were restrictions on what you could do, what occupations you could have, where you could go.
answers, but I need to take a minute to talk with you about funding for future lectures, and I want to thank you so much. I have learned so much about the slave trade in Tennessee. It was very... And also, I'm very interested to learn about what we're teaching our young people in schools, and I think that's a very salient piece of information that you've given us here tonight. So I'm thankful very much for that as well.
I think I'm going to go out and
Take a break.
set up my table.
Take a break. Well, we're going to have, I don't know how we're going to do questions and answers here too, but we'd like to have some more time for people to ask questions as well. But you can come back if you would.
I like to leave the room when they're asking for me.
Okay. So anyway, I really appreciated that, and I think he dispelled some myths about the slave trade in Tennessee, and really we learned a lot from him. I think he also really honored Reverend Palmer's legacy, and also our commitment in this church to social justice issues and civil rights in Tennessee. So I very much appreciate that. On behalf of the Palmer Lecture Committee and our congregation, I want to thank all of you for your generosity for just being here tonight. But I also want to thank the people who have come before you, because they are the people who, through their generous donations, have made it possible for us to do this lecture tonight. And so I am asking you, this is my ask, that you also pass along this generosity so that we can fund future Palmer lectures. This has been going on, as Gail has indicated, for many years, and it's really a salient part of our commitment to social justice in our community, and we can't do it unless we can raise some funds to seed the next lecture. So I'm asking you tonight to please generously donate. We've got some people who are going to pass around some baskets here in a minute. And if you feel that you would like to write a check, please feel welcome to do so. The check should be made out to the First UU Church of Nashville, earmarked to the Palmer Lecture. And I want to, again, thank you so much for being a vital part of what we do in our congregation in this community to move forward the social justice issues. We need it so much these days. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm not sure what we want to do now about a question and answer series.
We kind of lost our guys to answer the questions.
Yeah, so maybe just asking questions at the table when you get there. Thank you. Is he coming back in? Okay, thank you so very much.